Hello everyone, you are about to watch my thoughts and opinions on Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. But before we get into the review itself, there is one important detail that I forgot to mention in the review, so I want to get it out of the way here. I did mention it in the unboxing video for the package that I received this in, and I did mention it in the flip-through video that I did as well. But it does need to be said, or I feel like it needs to be said, that this was a product that was sent to me by Wizards of the Coast for the purposes of doing a review on. So I want to thank them for sending it to me, and I just want to make it clear that this was something that was sent for review, but it is not a paid or sponsored video. Wizards of the Coast did not send me any money or anything like that to do the reviews. They are not dictating what is said in the reviews. They are not only interested in getting glowing reviews or things like that. They're not reviewing this review before it goes out. They just sent this out and they want genuine and honest feedback. So that's what this video is going to be, and that's what all my reviews have been. But it is something that needs to be said, or I feel it needs to be said. So that's out of the way. I hope you enjoy my look at Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. This is the latest offering from Wizards of the Coast and is a campaign setting based off of Season 2, I believe, of Critical Role. This was a book that I have to admit I had some hang-ups or trepidations about when it was first announced, and even when I first picked it up. I'm not really into a lot of the live gameplay type series that are out there. I haven't really spent a lot of time watching Critical Role or a lot of the other ones that are put out by Wizards of the Coast, like for D&D 5th edition. I don't know quite what it is or how to explain it. I do watch Acquisitions Incorporated, but I only really watch their stage shows when they do the conventions. I don't actually watch the C team. I think it just has to do with the fact that I would rather only see, things a few times a year than have to feel like I need to watch 3 or 4 hours of weekly, campaigns. And truthfully, I just like stuff that's done for pure entertainment and for laughs, and not so much getting involved in really heavy stories or stuff like that. I'm just not big into the dramatic aspects of it, at least from watching live gameplay things. That's not to say that I don't think other people should, and I don't have anything against Critical Role, even though I'm not a fan of it. I don't think it's, this evil thing that's taking over the Dungeons & Dragons brand. I don't think it's something that is destroying gaming tables across the world. I think, if anything, it's probably good for the hobby. It's just not suited to my taste. But that's the show. How's the campaign setting? So I already did a full flip through of this in a previous video, so I'm not going to really be going through the book specifically here. This is more just me getting my thoughts out, so you can sit back and do something else while you listen to this, because this is more of a podcast kind of style review. The first thing I have to say is that I was concerned when I opened up the book and saw the phrase Critical Role probably about a dozen or so times within the first few pages. As someone, again, who's not a fan, I was worried that I was going to be beaten over the head with the fact that this was a Critical Role inspired book. But I will say that, honestly, after the first little introductory section, it doesn't really come up very often. I may have seen Critical Role mentioned maybe a couple of times, 2-3 times, throughout the rest of the course of the book. I do feel like there's probably a lot of references to previous episodes or adventures or campaigns or seasons. I know they mentioned Vox Machina, I think was the name of it, and I'm pretty sure that was one of the earlier seasons of the show, but truthfully, as someone who's not well versed in the Critical Role lore or the Critical Role series, I didn't feel like I was missing out on understanding the campaign setting as a result. So the allusions to the actual show itself are thankfully seem to be at least sparingly used or not so heavy-handed and obvious that I feel like I don't get it. So that's one thing I have to say that I really do appreciate. The campaign setting is supposed to be one that is based off the concept of war. The continent of Wildemount, which is one of the many continents in the world that they have for the Critical Role setting, is embroiled in this conflict between basically two major powers of the Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn dynasty. The Dwendalians are sort of your humans that have expanded, and some ways are okay that they've done it, and other ways are sort of questionable. And the Kryn dynasty is actually made up of drow that have rejected the teachings of Lolth and have come to the surface to make a new life for themselves. I have to say immediately that I really liked the Kryn dynasty, as in a previous campaign I actually had a concept in place where a group of drow were going to reject Lolth and return to the surface, but they weren't going to do it to become their own political faction. They were just going to try to reintegrate into elven culture and society. But I will say I do appreciate the fact that the Kryn dynasty exists as they do. The Kryn dynasty is also very interested in objects known as Luxon beacons, which can help reincarnate, if I recall correctly. It has something to do with things along those lines. And it's what I really like about them is just the fact, you can see it on the cover here in between the two major characters, is that it is shaped like a D12. And someone told me that on the Critical Role show they actually represent these beacons with a D12, and as someone who loves the oft-neglected D12, I have to say that that was something that I really did appreciate. The campaign, the setting itself also has sort of your 4 geographic regions that have sort of different drastic features to them. For example, where the Dwendalian Empire tends to occupy is sort of your more like farmland type of habitable area, where the Kryn dynasty, where they're set up, is kind of devastated by the fact that millennia ago it was the literal battlegrounds where gods and immortals fought each other. I also must say I appreciate the reference of immortals, which kind of reminds me of the BECME or the Basic Expert D&D rules. I don't know if that's meant to be a direct reference to the fact that they had immortals instead of gods, but it still seemed like a nice little nod there that I appreciated. The campaign setting also gives you a ton of races. It pretty much collects most of the player races that have been introduced in previous other products, but puts them all into one product. And that's something that I think is great, because that way you don't have to have all those other books like the Volo's Guide to Monsters, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, the Elemental Evil Player's Guide. You don't have to have those books now in order to have access to those races, which I think is fantastic. The setting itself is interesting. I like a lot of the way that it's done. It's well written. There's a lot of interesting elements to it. And I also really like the fact that they have sort of a smorgasbord of deities. It honestly feels like they took the 4th edition default world pantheon and used that as their main list of gods. For example, you have Pelor alongside of Bane, and you have Vecna, and you have the Raven Queen. So it's kind of, for me, as someone who liked the 4th edition version of D&D, I really appreciated seeing some of these gods together again and just being reminded of that version of the game. So again, another point in the win column, I guess you could say. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid world. I will say there are a couple of, I don't want to say issues or deal breakers, but these might be more along the lines of nitpicks, I guess. The fact that there is this weird sort of eclectic mix of gods and this huge array of races that you can use, all for this one continent. Now, I know that they're probably drawn from different parts of the world itself, and they're not necessarily trying to say that all of these races are 100% native to Wildemount, but having all those different options there does make it feel like a bit of, I mean, it makes it feel sort of like a homebrew, where it's like everything's on the table, if that makes sense in terms of the races involved. and as nice as it is to have them all collected into one book, I wonder if this is the right book for that, because I feel like maybe with this war focus being such a big thing, that perhaps, honestly, I feel like maybe having a tighter selection of races that are more well defined within the world, maybe, I don't know, it has a slight feeling of, okay, everybody in the pool kind of thing when it comes to the player character races. But again, it's nice to have them all in one book, especially for things like Adventurers League, because you can have this as your +1, except apparently you can't. Someone told me that this is not Adventurers League legal, which makes me wonder why bother having all those things included if that's not the case. Truthfully, I don't think Adventurers League is really that big of a deal anymore. I know in my area it's pretty much completely dead, and I don't think it should be something that tries to dictate what goes into the published materials or anything, but it just seems like a bit of an odd inclusion. The other major issue that I kind of have with this setting is the fact that for a campaign setting that's supposed to be embroiled in war, as this one is supposed to be, there's really not a lot of information on running war-based games in here. There's some information on styles of games that you can run that have war as sort of this background theme to it, but when it comes to actually using like any sort of mass battles, there's just nothing there. It literally just advises to do what you feel is right, or how you think it should go. And I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in that, because I feel like this would have been the perfect book to introduce something like a victory point system that can be used to apply to mass battle situations where the player character's deeds, whether successes or failures, can be used to swing the tide of battle or determine the outcome. Recently, I implemented a system like that in the 5th edition adventure that I had, where the city of Baldur's Gate was being attacked by Githyanki, and it's a simple system and it's easy to do, and I think it would be a great way to great thing to incorporate, so that it does let the player's actions drive the outcome of these battles, within reasons, obviously. But it's just sort of missing from this book. There's just really nothing there, and I just feel like that's a really big missed opportunity. It does say in the book that they don't necessarily want to focus too heavily on war, because some people may not be comfortable with that style of gameplay, which is fine, I understand that, but still having that system there for people that do want to focus on that, especially since it's supposed to be one of the major aspects of the world, or at least this continent, I just feel again that that's a bit of a missed opportunity. One thing that this book does have, though, are a few new options for a couple of classes. Fighters have a new subclass called the Echo Knight, and then you have the Dunamancy form of magic that wizards can use, and they can either look at chronergy or graviturgy. Chronergy is manipulating essentially like time, so a lot of the stuff sort of has to do with like initiative modifications, or freezing individuals in time, or gaining like speeding themselves up in time, things like that. Graviturgy is just sort of affecting mass and gravity, and those are all well and good. There's a whole host of new spells that apply to one or the other focus, which it does recommend that only subclasses that have access to those from this book should really be able to use those spells. They do seem a little bit more powerful. One of the chronourgy, or however you pronounce it, one of their spells is like an 8-hour duration, where someone can add a d8 to their initiative whenever they make a roll while the spell's going on. Seems kind of powerful, but honestly I don't know necessarily how game breaking any of this stuff is. It does, I actually, and I must kind of say that I don't mind spells being slightly more powerful than generic ones that anyone has access to if they are limited to a specific subclass or focus of a wizard's spellcasting ability. So I don't necessarily have any issues with that. You can introduce some of these spells if you wanted to through scrolls or ancient texts or stuff like that. If it really becomes something that you want to allow players to have access to, at least on a scaled back version, if they don't want to use the actual classes. But I actually really like the Echo Knight. I think it's actually a really kind of fun, interesting subclass for the fighter. The big thing with the Echo Knight is they create sort of this shadow double, is the best way to describe it, of themselves, and they can exist within a certain radius of each other. They don't have to be right next to each other necessarily, and I think as they go up in level, the distances that they can have between them increases. But what's cool about it is it grants the fighter in like an extra attack roll that they can make, and they can split up where the attacks come from because their shadow double can be used to make their attacks if you have them going against two different targets, for example. So if you had 3 attacks per round with this ability and you've got your shadow double manifested, you could have, you know, your first attack be at the target that your character is physically in front of, the second attack be the one that your double's in front of, and if the one that your double's in front of seems like it's a bit more on the ropes, for example, it took more damage and you want to finish it off, then you can choose where that other attack goes, and I think that's kind of a neat ability. They also, again, I think the ability to swap places with one another as you progress as well, so you can switch with your double, and your double, you know, is sort of a glass cannon thing, so it can be destroyed, but it just seems like a really interesting concept, and I actually like that one quite a bit. As far as the subclass of wizard goes with the Dunamancy, it's okay. I don't hate the idea of slightly more powerful spells that are more restricted in who can use them. I've seen some people sort of complain about that, but for me that's not really that big of a deal. There's also some useful information on, you know, creating your characters and theming them and stuff like that in there as well, which I think is a great little section to have in there. Overall, it's a decent book. I should say there's actually one more thing that I do find a bit perplexing, and that's the fact that unless I missed them, and I may have, but unless I missed them, there are no stat blocks for any of the major NPCs that you come across. There are some new creatures, some new monsters that you can use, but I didn't find a single stat block for any of the NPCs. And again, maybe I just missed them when I was flipping through the book and reading through it. And if I did, I apologize for that, and will certainly accept that I am wrong. But I just couldn't come across any of them. The Eberron campaign setting had some important NPCs listed in there. It certainly didn't have all of them, and there are some notable ones that weren't present, but it still at least contained a few of them. The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica had the Guildmasters for all of the guilds, or at least most of the guilds, in there as well. So the fact that this gives you just some new monsters, again, was something that I found really disappointing, especially, again, in a war campaign where a very realistic scenario would be that the player characters are hired to take out one or the other, you know, either, if not leader, at least some very notable people within the political structure of those empires or dynasties or whatever you want to call them. So again, I think that was something that feels like sort of missed, and I think that would have really helped out the book quite a bit. At the end of the day, I think it's an interesting world. I think it's an interesting setting, and I think there are some fun adventures that you can have in there. I do also like the inclusion of 4 ready-to-go adventures for first-level characters. They're all for first-level characters, but they all take place in one of the 4 different major geographical regions. So it gives you 4 different sort of feeling or flavored campaign or adventures that you can use to introduce your players to the setting and maybe even build off of to create some campaigns of your own. So that part of it is really well done, and there's a lot of stuff to really like here. There are some things, again, that just makes it feel a bit incomplete, in my opinion. Having a ton of races is great, and I do like the fact that there's a lot of variety there, but it's sort of lacking in class-related stuff. You got, a subclass for fighters, and then it goes immediately to wizards, so there's just a lot of classes that seem kind of left out. And honestly, I feel like fighters and wizards kind of get enough stuff already that it would have been nice to have seen some new things for some of the other classes. But again, I don't know the source material all that well, so it could be that those are the only things that have been introduced so far, and that's why they're the only things in here. I don't know that. It would have been nice to have had at least a little bit more to it, but at the same time, you are getting new options, so I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth when it comes to something like that. So more would be great. I'm not going to say that I would hold it against the book that there was the stuff for the two classes. But it would have been nice to have seen more, especially considering that you have so many races to choose from. Some other stuff would have been great to have in there as well. But yeah, it's solid. Is it the best of the campaign settings released so far? I would say probably not. In fact, if I honestly had to rank it, I would probably put this at number 3 of the 3 books in terms of how much I personally would want to run games set in this world. It's not a criticism against Critical Role or anything like that, before people get defensive over that. It's just the fact that it's interesting, but I feel that there's enough stuff that should have been included or could have been included that would have put this over the top, that the fact that none of that stuff is in there just makes me feel a little ho-hum about it. Again, major NPCs would have been great to have included. More comprehensive rule sets on how to run large-scale conflicts, I think, should have been a no-brainer for a campaign setting where that's supposed to be a very real part of it. But again, there's some good stuff in here. This was the one campaign setting book that when I started reading through it, it just didn't click with me personally to the extent that the others did. Of course, with Eberron, it's one of my favorite D&D settings to begin with, so just from that basis of personal bias, that's why I would have that one at number 1. But honestly, the Ravnica setting was one that really surprised me with how good it was and how easy it seems to have some stuff to work with to create some interesting campaigns here. And I just feel like there's a little bit too much work for this setting for me to want to put into it when there's other worlds that I personally am more interested in. But that's something that is a personal decision on my part, and again, not something that I would expect everyone else to agree with. So the whole point of this video isn't to tell you how you should feel about this book. It's just to describe sort of what's in here and how I feel about it. And if you agree, then you may want to consider passing on this. But if you disagree, or if the things that I have issues with or would have liked to have seen in the book, if they're not something that you're particularly worried about, because I don't have a lot of opportunity to work on running campaigns or writing campaigns, so that's why this isn't something that I'm too interested in. But if you are someone who loves to do that and loves to design or stat out your NPCs and your villains and your allies and all that stuff and really want to put that work into it, then this is a fantastic book. It does give you some basic descriptions of some of the major players, so it's not like you're completely working from nothing. I just would have liked to have seen the stat blocks personally, but those are my thoughts on it. I do think it is a well-written book. I do think that it is an interesting world, and again, I liked some of the callbacks to things like the 4th edition deities, or at least a deity list that feels more in line with 4th edition, with the Raven Queen and having Bane and Vecna in the same world. I mean, those are some of my favorite deities as it is anyway, so having them together is something that definitely scores points for me. And I, again, like the reference to immortals. I thought that was a nice little touch that maybe I'm just completely misreading it, but I think it was cool nonetheless. So there's a lot to like about this book. There's just a few admittedly nitpicky things that is enough to detract for me personally. But again, as time goes on, I may start to change my tune on that. I have with other things in the past, so this is certainly a never say never scenario. And I do believe that there are extra adventures that are put out by Wizards of the Coast to help support this world as well. So I don't think you're necessarily going to do poorly by getting this. Let's just put it that way. I don't think it's something you're going to look at and hate or regret buying. It's just there was just enough little tiny things that I thought could have been improved on for me personally. But again, that's just my personal opinion. But there is, at the same time, a lot to like about this book as well. So my recommendation is to pick it up if you are interested in the idea of the world with the warring nations, like the actively warring nations. That is something that's not really been a part of the other major settings to be released to date. So if that's your thing, or if you're a fan of Critical Role, then this is probably something that by this point you already have anyway. But if you were someone that was interested, but you didn't want to have something that feels like it's shoving Critical Role down your throat, honestly, after the first few pages, which is an introduction anyway, I don't think it's really that, over the top when it comes to that. So if that's your concern, it's really not that bad. And again, I have to say, another major point that I say is in the favor of this book is that the Luxon beacons, these relics that the Kryn dynasty holds in such high esteem or high regard, the fact that they're represented by D12s is really, really cool in my book. But anyway, let me know in the comments below if you guys have picked up Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, what you think of it. Let me know if you've been running adventures or campaigns based in it, and yeah, just let me know some of your thoughts on it as well. If you're not interested, or if you weren't interested but picked it up anyway and changed your minds on it, just let me know what you think about this book in general based on your own personal experiences, because everyone's opinions are going to be different for different reasons. So anyway, that was my thoughts on Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.